This Week in Science and Education is presented in association with the Science Coordinators and Consultants Association of Ontario. Visit their website at sccao.ca.
This Week in Science and Education is brought to you in part by the University of Western Ontario, www.uwo.ca. We thank them for their support. This Week in Science and Education is also brought to you by Laurentian University. Check out Laurentian at laurentian.ca. We thank them for their support.
Hi, welcome to This Week in Science and Education. I'm Nicole Tate-Hill, filling in for Kevin Kugler, and I have my panelists here. We have Thomas Merritt from Laurentian University.
Good afternoon.
And we have Colin Jagoe with a room full of people. Colin, can you sort of fill us in on who you've got there with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see everybody. We're at Kawartha Pine Ridge, the District School Board, where I am most days in my job and in the podcast. And I've got some folks with me today. We're going to talk to them today about what they're doing. To my immediate left is Mike Noonan, who we've talked before on the podcast, so it's great to have Mike back. Mike is from Smarter Science. So, Mike, maybe just give us the 5 second on what you do.
What I do is I go around the province of Ontario and now across the country talking about inquiry-based science with teachers and how to implement it in the classroom.
Awesome. And it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce these three folks because there's some teachers that have been doing some of this inquiry-based science in their classrooms. So starting on my right is Michelle. Michelle, just give us where you are and your background.
I'm Michelle Greer. I teach at Lakefield Intermediate School, and I'm a grade 8 homeroom teacher, and I teach grade 7 and 8 science.
Awesome. And Stewart?
Stewart Ross. I teach at Bowmanville High School. I teach grades 9 to 12, geography and science.
Okay, and on far end here, hopefully you can see him, is Peter.
Peter Evo, I'm a teacher at Dale Road Senior Public School, and I teach grade 8 math and science.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, guys. And Mike and I were talking earlier, and we'd wish we'd recorded like the first hour and a half of our day because we've had such rich conversations on around what people are doing in the class. It's just amazing. So maybe, Mike, you can sort of start us off by talking about what you see in their classrooms and how that jives with what's going on provincially.
I'm finding it quite remarkable. We started working on this program about 2 years ago and talking about inquiry to teachers and with teachers and urging them to try more inquiry in classrooms. It's not like inquiry is a brand new invention. This has been around for over 100 years. But what we provided to them was strategies. And what I'm finding is that we are right across the province now. Next week I'm going to Sudbury. The week following that I'll be in Thunder Bay. And tomorrow I'm in Oakville. So this is happening everywhere. And I'm finding all teachers I talk to, without exception, want to try these types of approaches in their classroom. And I'm hearing wonderful stories where people are actually transforming their own practice by doing this. And the stories are coming in daily in terms of the fact that science education in Ontario is changing.
And some of the stories is what we were sharing earlier today. And maybe just we'll go across here, and each of you can give sort of a little snippet of some of the things that we talked about this morning, things that are happening in your classroom that you've done that you find the inquiry process has really either changed or really helped students along. So maybe we'll start with Michelle.
Well, I changed things around this year, and I started off with starting my science program with the inquiry method right off the bat. So we did a lot of investigations and learning the process. And what I found from that now that usually with students generates so many questions based on whatever we're doing now. Because they've learned to generate more questions and to be able to get the opportunities to figure things out for themselves, which makes them more interested in the topic, whatever it is. And I find I do a lot of things backwards now.
What do you mean by backwards?
Well, what I mean by backwards is instead of always presenting information and doing all that first, now they have an event to experience and they generate their own questions and they can do their own finding out what the reasons are behind it. So it's kind of turned everything around.
Which is good in education sometimes, I guess. Stuart, what's some things you've been doing?
Along the same lines as Michelle, trying to start with inquiry in the classroom the first few days and getting kids interested in the process rather than their product. And it just makes it more interesting for them. They're not concerned with what, they're more concerned with how. So.
Peter, what's going on?
And I find I'm using the inquiry process as well, like these two other individuals. But also my class is very diverse, from autism all the way up to gifted. And since grade 8 is not streamed, we have a variety of abilities, I find the inquiry method allows kids to communicate and share their ideas effectively, and then go off of that to back learn, I guess you'd call it, at their own speed. So therefore you can provide a rich environment for not only the child who's struggling, but the child who is bored.
And just pick on you one more time, you shared some really neat stuff around how you've taken math and implemented some inquiry steps in math. Maybe just share that real quick. I thought that was very interesting.
Well, at our school, one of our goals for this year is to improve our math skills, basically, and to improve the idea of math inquiry. And so what we have done now is I get them in groups, and then I might just throw a question, or I might just throw a shape in front of them, and then tell them to start describing the properties of that shape, or investigate how we can use that shape, be it in construction or whatever. And what happens is that, again, you get kids at different levels being able to analyze and interpret the information, and then feedback to me, both in writing and orally, how they can do it, and also present to their other colleagues. So it works great. Math and science can go hand in hand, and they go cross-curricular. Pretty soon they start talking science and math, and they get tricked into it.
They get tricked into it. Yeah. And that's really neat. That's one of the things we found about this approach that has been really valuable, is that cross-curricular integration, helping the kids see it very often. That sometimes the links aren't necessarily obvious, but it makes them explicit for kids, I think, sometimes.
Thomas, how do you think this will change things for the average first-year university student? Do you think this is going to help better prepare them for what they're going to see in their first year, or do you think it's even going to be much of a change in terms of the way they think by the time they get to the end stage?
Well, okay, so sort of a loaded question, because if I say no, then our day is over. But
no, it just gives us more stuff to talk about.
I'm listening to this. I'm taking notes. It's really exciting. I've got a bunch of questions, and so I'll answer your question, and then maybe I get a chance to ask a couple of questions. One of the biggest challenges that I've run into as an educator, and I've only been doing this for 5 years, right? But when I talk to the people that have been here longer than I've been here, we're constantly faced with trying to get kids excited about learning the same way that you are at the high school, but get them asking questions. And I teach a lot of upper level courses, so these are kids that are 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. They're third, fourth year university students, and they should have a lot of knowledge, and now I'm pushing them to try to synthesize that and work with it. And this is something they've never seen, or they haven't seen it in a long time. And we've got kids that are used to, this is the information, here it is. Now it's on a PowerPoint. You don't even have to write it down. You just have to memorize it and spit it back. And I'm teaching a course now. I have 7 students in the class, and it would be silly to just have them memorize things. And it's a field that changes every year, and so I'm trying to do it based on primary literature. And the kids are game and they're trying, but they don't have a background of generating questions or even answering questions. They have a background of spitting material back. So, the idea that, and so here I am with a fourth year class. These kids are going to graduate in, 6 months. And I'm trying to teach them how to think critically and to actually draw conclusions on their own. And that's too late in the game, right? But now you're telling me that as early as 7th and 8th grade and earlier than that, we're going to be working with kids to do the things that we as university educators are saying that we're struggling with. So is it going to change things? Absolutely. It sounds exciting. It sounds really fantastic. These are the kind of issues that we're really stuck with even advanced students at the undergraduate level. We can't get them to ask questions. We can't get them to think critically. We can get them to spit material back to us. So yeah, I think it'll be fantastic.
So we'll just take a quick break, and we'll be right back with This Week in Science and Education.
This Week in Science and Education is brought to you by Sheridan Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. At Sheridan, students shine brighter. Check out sheridanc.on.ca.
So we're back with This Week in Science and Education. And Thomas, I know you had some questions. You're really excited about the Smarter Science framework and how kids are going to be thinking differently when they get to that university stage. So maybe you could sort of ask them what you're thinking.
Exactly. And what I'm going to do is just ask an open question, and I can get all 5 of you really to give me your opinion on this. So one of the things that I've faced with the course that I'm teaching now is, in theory, I have a curriculum that I'm supposed to teach. And I don't really want to do that. What I want to do is get the kids thinking about the topics bioinformatics, genomics, and working with an incredibly dynamic field. What are we going to talk about this semester? What are we going to study? But I do have a certain number of facts that I'm supposed to hit. So as high school teachers, how are you working with the inquiry-based system and the idea that there is a set curriculum that we've got decades worth of background that says this is what you have to teach in a course? How do you integrate that kind of requirement with the inquiry-based system? Has it been a challenge? Is it not a challenge? Is it easy to do? What are you finding?
You know what's funny, Thomas? I was sitting here. I was going to ask you the same question about it. So we'll go around. We'll go around these guys, and then we'll come back to you, because it's one of those things that whenever you start to talk about inquiry-based teaching, people go, yes, but what about the stuff?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And we've had some really good conversations at a number of times around that. So we'll start on the other end, and we'll come back this way. Maybe we'll end with Mike this time. Peter, like that content versus process question. How do you address that?
Well, I think the person who first delivers the information, the teacher, has to be well versed with curriculum and actually know what the big ideas are. And once we know what the big ideas are, there are times, and I won't lie, this is a whole tool in the toolbox, and there are times where you have to give them that information. But you give it at the end, after they investigate, and then you say, here's what has been discovered before you expanded upon that. So to make a long story short, you have to know your curriculum, you have to know the big ideas, and then you have to, during the process, put that big idea in there, whatever stage you think the kids are ready to handle it. Sometimes it's at the beginning, but sometimes it's at the end after the inquiry. It all depends on your class. What's your class made up? Graduate students, it probably will be at the beginning. My students, it probably will be at the end.
Yeah. Stewart, we were talking earlier this morning, and you teach grade 12 university biology.
Yeah.
We were having exactly this conversation. So what are some of the things you do?
Well, it's I try to mimic their university experience as best as possible, giving them as much. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. You give them the bits and pieces of information and give them time to discover that. Give them time to research it. Give them time to learn on their own. And I guess that's also teaching them efficient use of time. But like Peter was saying, I know what the big ideas are in that curriculum, and I'll try to manipulate the situation to make sure they're getting that, but then allowing them opportunities to discover on their own. What do they want to learn about? And always trying to connect that with what the bigger goals are. I guess the curriculum will tell me what I have to teach, but it's not telling me how I have to teach it. So.
And let me just jump in really quickly before we go to the rest of our panel. We don't do that at university, and we don't do it enough, and we know that we need to do it better. University education, at least for the 20 years that I've been involved with university education, is route memorization. 9 times out of 10, it's not thinking about the material, it's not thinking critically, it's not coming up with hypotheses. And this is one reason that in the U.S., at least the system that I went through, honors university or honors programs became a big deal, because most education was route, and we would have these honors programs where kids would have to think. Or when I was an undergrad, it was a lot of research, and the only time that I ever got to think critically in the 5 years that I did a 4-year degree program was when I was doing my independent research project as a graduating fifth-year student, senior student. And that's been, now that I'm on the other side as a professor, this is what I push kids to do. Get into research, get into undergraduate research, because it's the only time that you get to think critically. We're trying to do better with that in the courses, but we're not doing a good enough job. And that's where this sort of conversation back and forth, how do we do a better job in the classroom? What we do have at the university level is the opportunity to get the kids into the lab, into some sort of research environment where they do have to think critically. But I can guarantee you 9 times out of 10 coursework does not require critical thinking. It requires, unfortunately, route memorization.
So, Michelle, how do you address that in your grade 8 class, like that content versus process?
Well, I'm fairly new to this, so basically the strategy I've implemented is dissecting the curriculum, taking the topics that I need to teach, and then how can I make each of those topics inquiry-based as we go through. So, like for instance, we were talking about density. How can I make discovering density and all that kind of stuff inquiry-based?
Right.
And then eventually what I'd like to do is, once we end the unit, get it less test-based and have it a project or experiment on their own using the topics we've been inquiring about throughout the unit.
Right.
So.
Right.
Okay, so one of the things that I've tried to do with this course that I'm teaching, actually with all three of the courses that I teach, is to get away from traditional tests and to integrate other things in addition to tests. The best courses that I had as an undergrad, and there were 3 of them out of the 5 years that I was an undergrad. There were other good courses, but there were 3 courses that were outstanding. And one of the reasons that each of those courses was outstanding was the way that we were examined. And what I try to do, especially with the small classes, all the exams are take-home. So it's not a matter of memorization. You've got a project, essentially, that you have to complete as a take-home exam. I was a professor on Long Island for a year before I moved up here. That university, Long Island University, has a program called Writing Across the Curriculum. And it's essentially it's an extra thing that goes on your degree if you complete those criteria. And the point is to get students writing. And one thing that I will beg high school teachers to do is force your kids to write. And even if it's a math class, even if it's a science class, whatever it is, make the students write their results in a coherent, intelligible fashion. And I get hammered by the students because I'm making them write. And I've had more than one student, more than one semester, this is not an English class. It's not. But you have to be able to communicate. And, we get kids that even if we can get kids that are thinking critically, they think critically, then they write something in text. And, it's not always that bad, but occasionally it's that bad. So moving away from traditional tests and moving into other ways to evaluate the students, the drawback is I haven't found any way to do it that's not incredibly time-consuming. But we have to get the kids communicating. And learning the material is one thing, communicating the material is another. One of my big rationales that I tell all of the students when we do this is very few of them are going to go into whatever I'm teaching them. I'm not creating molecular geneticists. I'm not creating bioinformaticists. I'm trying to create well-read, intelligent, critically thinking individuals that can do something else. No matter what else they do, they will have to communicate that. And if they come out of my course with the ability to write a topic sentence for a paragraph, that may be more useful than being able to figure the gene number in a bacterial genome.
Right. It's great that you say that because we talk about the cross-curricular integration, and I mean, in the content versus process thing, I fall sort of somewhere in the middle. Like, I think it can never be either all one way or the other. It needs to be sort of a coherent blend, right? Like these guys talked about putting in content when the kids need it, right? And if a kid gets something, they're doing something and they can't figure something out, and in your mind, because you're the content expert, as Peter said, you know the curriculum, you go, oh, if they just do this little bit, and you say, come with me for 5 minutes, and on the board you do a quick formula or something, and they go, oh, and then they're off to the races again. So it's always a blend of that, and it's when the kids need it and are ready for it. And what you're saying with the writing is those kids need to be able to do certain things at certain times, and so you're putting in those skills that sometimes are kind of dry, but you need them at a certain time. So you're doing the same thing, as far as I can see. Mike, where do you fall? I know where you fall on this process versus content thing, but give us your opinion.
I challenge teachers all the time to think about the fact that they could probably put the content in their course into 3 weeks if they did it continuously. It varies, but 3 weeks is a talking point. And then what I do is I say, okay, you've got those 3 weeks, spread it out over your semester, and think about the deep inquiry that you can do based on those points. And so that's what I'm challenging people with, is that you don't have to do the minutiae that's laid out in the curriculum for you. It's more a case of get them practicing problem solving and critical thinking and things like that. I think what comes out of what you said is a really important point that needs to be done, and that's discourse between universities in Ontario as to what's a minimum that's expected in first-year kids. Maybe a writing capability, certain basic elements coming from the grade 12 biology, physics, chemistry courses. I look at science as numeracy and literacy in action, so I totally agree with you, Thomas, on that. Now, we start at kindergarten, so this whole framework starts at kindergarten, goes to grade 12. So I'm saying by grade 12, these kids should be experts at it.
And you have to do that. You can't start this in grade 8. You can't start it in fourth year university. I can assure you of that. Mike, there are a bunch of things that jump out from what you've just said. One of the points I wanted to go back to was not just writing, but different forms of communication. And I may have talked about this on the podcast before, but one of the courses that I teach, I've incorporated, it's an experimental biochemistry. They actually come into my lab, they come into somebody else's lab, and the students do hands-on experiments, they generate data. The fourth-year students here in biochemistry, the discipline that I'm in, every one of them has to do a research project. And at the beginning of the year, they have to defend the proposal in front of the department. At the end of the year, they defend their undergraduate thesis. And one of the students I had in a course was a very good student. She got up to defend her proposal in front of a group of about 24 people, and she was making up words. I was seriously concerned she was going to wet herself. She was absolutely terrified. And wow. I spoke to her in class because she was a very bright woman, and she had not stood up in front of a group of people since she was in high school. And so I said, okay, well, we're not going to do that anymore. And every course that I teach, students have to present in front of the classroom. Right. So every course that I teach, they have to write something, and usually it's write a series of things. They have to get up and give presentations. And again, at the end of the day, I'm producing very few bioinformaticists, but if I'm producing people that can stand up in front of a classroom and present some ideas and present them critically and understand, and one of the things I've tried to do with the students this year is I keep telling them, don't waste my time. If I have to read your writing assignment, at the end of reading that writing assignment, I should feel like I've learned something, or I've just wasted half an hour trying to grade this thing, and it's just going to make me angry and I'll give you a terrible grade. So, I'm trying to get them to think about what the goal is, and the goal is not to get the number next to their name that they need to move to the next semester. It's to communicate some ideas. I mean, that's why I teach, is to communicate something. And I'm trying to get them to do the same thing back to me. So when you work with the high school kids, get them to present to the other students, to present to each other, present to the teacher. It can be really nerve-wracking, but no matter what they do next, it's going to be important. And I think we all know that the best way to learn something is to actually teach it. And you can't fake it. You can't stand up in front of the classroom and try to explain next generation sequencing and have a couple of buzzwords that you put on the board, smile, nod, and sit down. Right. You're going to have to understand the material.
I have a question. I was reading a McCain article, and it talked about the universities these days struggling with the fact with students wanting more job preparation in university. Kind of an applied degree versus a straightforward, old-fashioned theoretical degree. Is that where you think the universities are heading, and the colleges are heading more to the applied aspects of a degree versus just straight back theory?
And it comes down to money. I mean, we are at an economic point where people want to know what their money is going for. And at the end of the day, we have an obligation to provide the student with something. To many students, what they want to be provided with is a number next to their name that allows them to get into dental school, professional school, whatever it is. And that's sort of the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is we're actually teaching them to do something. Now, like I said, very few of my students go on to be bioinformaticists, but hopefully they're going to do something where they can use the material. There is a push. That's an enormous topic.
It is.
And it's not just at the education system. It's very much in all of science at the moment. Science funding for science, for research, not for education, is pushing more and more towards immediately applicable industry ties. How is this going to be used? And away from basic science. And I understand where that's coming from. And I actually, probably as more than some and less than others, think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's always nice to keep in mind where we're going. But undirected basic research is also fundamentally important, and what you've got to do is try to find a balance between those. And we've talked about that before on the podcast. How do you balance this? I think I take the same approach with education. When I was an undergraduate at University of North Carolina, I have a science degree, but I took a lot of literature. I took sculpture my first semester, and I think that kind of thing's important, to have a broad-based education. But at the end of the day, I had a set of skills that allowed me to do something next. And so I think we can, as educators, try to find a balance between those. I think there is a value to having a general education. Part of our challenge as educators is to convince people of that. And, you know, in economic times, it's harder to convince people of that. But, you know, it is a good point. We don't want to just teach people basic knowledge for the sake of teaching them basic knowledge and not have an idea of what they're going to be next, what they're going to be doing next. And, you know, that the particular conflict that you're talking about is something we hear a lot about. And I think that as university educators, we can benefit from thinking about that idea. What are we preparing the students to do next? I've always known that I was going to be a professor. And so when I was going through the education system, it was an easy sell. I mean, whatever I was learning was going to help me be a prof. But if I was going to do something else, I'd want to know what
I wanted to be a professor too, but I made it as a grade 8 teacher. So
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Excellent. Well, just a quick, to sort of wrap it up here, how can teachers get involved so that they can get onto this exciting new framework? Can we get some information on where they can go?
They certainly can. They can go to smarterscience.ca, and there's all sorts of information there for them. Some teachers I know have self-started them already, and they've actually come to us after they've been practicing it for themselves for a while. So it's a good resource to go to, smarterscience.ca, and we're also on Facebook and we're also on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. On behalf of VROC, I'd like to thank our guests today, Thomas and Colin, and Mike, Michelle, Stewart, and Peter. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next week on This Week in Science and Education.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.